Ambassador Karen Pierce is the United Kingdom's representative here in the nation's capital. Before that, she was ambassador at the United Nations, and she joins us this morning. Ambassador, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me, Margaret.
So part of your job is to explain to London what is going on in the United States, both with the American people and the US government. Given the economic, medical crisis, now the violence in the streets, the racial strife, I wonder, how do you explain this back home?
There's huge interest in what happens in America at all times in the UK. And as you suggest, particularly at the moment, I like to think of myself as a friend of America. This is the fourth time I've served here, and I'm saddened by what we're seeing on the pictures and what's happening, but also the underlying issues. There have been protests also in the UK. The issue of racial inequality is one that we all need to tackle. We've been watching the protests. I think some of what we've seen has been alarming, if I may say so. We're also very keen that people should be able to protest peacefully. That's a very important part of a free society. At the moment, we're just reporting back to London on what's happening. I think there is a sense that the COVID pandemic is making tensions worse, particularly when one thinks of economic hardships and also these striking racial disparities that are arising out of the crisis outcomes.
The UK will be hosting this Thursday a summit on vaccines, and I know your Prime Minister invited President Trump. Will the US be participating?
We very much hope so. As you say, the Prime Minister spoke to the President last week. We hope the President might be able to record a video for the conference, and then other US officials, I think in particular the acting head of USAID, will be taking part. And the US has very generously donated $1 billion to the global vaccine cause. We're looking in this, it's a 5-year period, and the aim of the summit is to raise $7.4 billion, which is called replenishment. It's the amount Gavi needs so it can carry out vaccinations of around 300 million people for the next 5 years. And of that 7.4 billion, 1 billion is coming from the United States.
And Gavi is what you're using to refer to this global vaccines initiative.
Yes, it's an alliance. It was put together to have a number of organizations like WHO and UNICEF. It has a number of donor countries. The US is one where another, Norway's another country that's made a very big donation. And if you like, it's a fast delivery arm of the global health system so that vaccines get to people quickly. And in particular, it does a lot of fantastic work with children. As the UK, we've just given £300 million, so over $400 million, and that's primarily to try and vaccinate 75 million children. So it does great work. It's a real success story, I think, of the international community.
And this is not just about COVID-19 and the potential of a vaccine. This is also other types. Does the US pulling out of the World Health Organization impact these initiatives?
Gavi tends to deal with long-running diseases like typhoid. The COVID-19 vaccines are on the whole being developed through other mechanisms, as you say, through the WHO, but also elsewhere. There's a big effort going on to make sure that the vaccines and diagnostics will be available to developing countries, in fact, to all countries who need them, regardless of whether they invent them or produce them. The United States has said that it will still contribute the same amount of funding to the global health system as it gave to WHO. So we await to see more details of that.
One of the things that we had been told by White House officials is that the diplomacy as it relates to a COVID vaccine, a lot of that will be happening through the G7, through the biggest economies who have been in alliance through the G7 up to this point. Since that summit is no longer on the schedule for this month, and we don't know if it will be pushed off to the fall or not, Do you see complications to some of the vaccine diplomacy among these global powers?
I don't think so, to be honest, because different ministers from different disciplines still meet under G7, and officials are still working together. So Dominic Raab, who's the British Foreign Secretary, he put forward a plan at the start of the crisis around developing vaccines, helping resilience in developing countries, and helping the UN contribute to that. And then there were other strands about keeping global trade routes open and getting British nationals and other nationals home. And those strands have more or less formed the bedrock of the G7's work in this area. And that continues between officials, particularly health officials of all the countries concerned. So while it would be nice to have leaders come together and put the seal on that, the work is going on behind the scenes.
There are over 100 different vaccines in development all across the world. One of them that has gotten a lot of attention is being developed in the UK. The Oxford vaccine that now they have partnered with AstraZeneca to produce it. And we know US taxpayers have provided quite a lot of funding to the potential of buying 300 million doses of it. But I wonder, if the UK gets a vaccine first, who gets that first shot in the arm? How is that being figured out?
That's a very good question, and you know, lots of countries are very interested in that answer. This is what the summit on 4th of May that the UK held with the European Union, France and Germany was particularly looking at, because you've got the problem, first of all, of developing a vaccine that works, and then you've got the problem of having to produce it at scale so we can get it distributed, and that in itself is an additional step that may be quite difficult. So officials and ministers are coming together to try and work out the answers to those questions. It is possible, but only possible, that one might want to start with health workers in a range of countries and then broaden out. Countries, governments will need to work out what is the best way of accessing the vaccine for their own workers and their populations. But there's now much more of a coordinated global effort to get the answers to those questions.
So the US didn't participate in that May summit, but is it your understanding that the US will come to an agreement with the UK on how to prioritize who gets it first?
I'm not sure exactly what the mechanism will be for that, to be honest, but it is our understanding that everybody involved in the vaccines is very keen to see them produced at a scale that will ensure that every country who needs them gets them.
Many poorer countries, particularly those in Africa, have pushed for any kind of vaccine to be patent-free or to pool the patent so that there would be easier, cheaper access around the world. Where is the UK on that? Because the US hasn't clearly said it supports it. Does the UK support that idea?
We are part of an initiative called ACT Act, which is trying to find the best way to get these vaccines produced at scale and delivered right the way around the world where they're needed. Mm-hmm. It's implicit in that we will have to sort out the patent issue. Whether that's by making things patent-free or whether it's by some other means hasn't yet, to the best of my knowledge, been decided. But it is one of the questions we will need to look very closely at.
If a US company discovers a vaccine and is able to manufacture it and is the first to have something that's usable, is the UK confident that your nationals would have access to it and quickly?
I don't want to say in the absence of there actually being a vaccine, right, in the circumstances that might come with that. But we are certainly working very closely with all of our international partners in Europe, around the world, with the US to try and get safe, credible vaccines developed quickly and got to everyone who needs them.
Do you see this as the prime focus, though, for world leaders to have a reason to get together in the fall?
The particular thing about G7 is that it's the world's major industrialized nations. So they bring a certain weight and input to the global economy. And as we all come out of the COVID pandemic, I think one of the really important themes will be global confidence in world economic recovery. And a second important theme will be what our Prime Minister Boris Johnson calls building back better. How do we make sure that the economic recovery is sustainable and is green, that it actually contributes to progress in some important areas. So I think that will be a very important theme of the G7 leaders whenever they get together.
Do you think Russia needs to be there as well, as President Trump has said he wants to invite them?
G7 is made up, as I said, 7 industrialized nations. The European Union is there, but it's always open to the presidency of each G7 to invite other countries to participate on certain themes, and you've seen that. It's a different question if you want to expand the membership of G7. For that, you actually need all the members to agree, and not all members do agree that Russia should be included in G7, and that primarily goes back to Russian annexation of Crimea. But in terms of inviting other countries for individual sessions, that's been a long-standing practice, and on the whole, it works well.
You know, one of the backdrops for the moment we are in is this growing international tension between the United States and China, the world's 2 largest economies. The COVID outbreak has added to that, and then we have this recent action related to Hong Kong that has, led the Trump administration to take some actions. I wonder what the UK view is on that. Should more action be taken as it relates to Hong Kong, or should the focus be on lowering tension?
We're very concerned at the Chinese national security law. We look to the Chinese to change their approach. We urge them to abide by the Sino-British Joint Declaration that sets out Hong Kong's status, that has the force of an international agreement. We're looking at British people in Hong Kong who hold a certain type of British passport, and looking to see whether we can extend their access to Britain. So we follow this with great concern. We also raised it along with the US and Germany at the Security Council in New York recently. I'm sure that when the G7 gets together, if the situation in Hong Kong has not improved, I'm sure that's something the G7 will look at. And I think along with looking at the global economic recovery, G7 will want to urge all countries to play by the international rules. And that, I think, is a particular concern with China, as we've seen over the virus and over certain trading and security practices.
Given how reliant the world is on China's production of protective gear, and then the potential that China could get a vaccine first, does it make that more complicated?
I think there's a very important aspect here of international cooperation. From the British perspective, we want to prioritize international cooperation to overcome the pandemic and get us on the road to recovery, and then address some of the underlying issues that I just mentioned. So we would certainly give priority to that. China does have a very large production capability, as you'd expect. I just note that not all the equipment that comes out of China is up to the standards that Western countries, other countries might expect. So that will be a factor. But I think the important thing at the moment is to have as much international cooperation around dealing with the pandemic as possible, and then address some of these other issues.
Understood. Ambassador Pierce, thank you very much for your time this morning.
Thank you very much for having me.